¿Qué tal? Bienvenidos, bienvenidas, bienvenides. Les habla Pacho, el director del Museo Universitario del Chopo. Hoy arrancamos con este ciclo de conversaciones sobre arte, política y contracultura en el mundo actual. Hemos invitado a creadores, pensadoras y activistas de diferentes hemisferios, tradiciones, prácticas y generaciones para que conversaran desde su campo de acción y experiencia acerca de los problemas urgentes de un mundo que parece estar en mutación. Un mundo afectado además por una pandemia global que parece haber acelerado una transición que aún no sabemos hacia dónde se dirige. El cambio climático, el auge de la extrema derecha, la persistencia del racismo, los significados y los riesgos de la virtualidad, el papel del arte y de las instituciones que lo hacen posible, los cuerpos disidentes, la vigencia y el futuro de las contraculturas o la pertinencia de seguir usando o no este término para referirnos a las disidencias colectivas en los estilos de vida, los derechos de los pueblos originarios y afrodescendientes, la organización comunitaria, los feminismos, la descolonización, el espacio, la geografía. Todos estos son temas que han estado de por sí relacionados con la programación del Museo Universitario del Chopo en los últimos años. Un museo universitario que desde su fundación ha estado abierto al entorno. Este ciclo es para pensar desde el lado B de la cultura y la creación, para usar una metáfora musical. O mejor dicho, desde los múltiples lados B posibles. Porque en un mundo que presenta escenarios cada vez más polarizados, en posturas que parecen irreconciliables, nos parece urgente reivindicar la posibilidad de escuchar la pluralidad de voces, de prácticas y visiones en un mundo diverso. Para ello, desde el Museo Universitario del Chopo, en colaboración con el Centro de Estudios Postcoloniales de Goldsmith, en Londres, decidimos preguntar a varios amigos cómo se piensa al mundo hoy. Quiero agradecer a Manuel Suárez Lastra, director del Instituto de Geografía de la UNAM, a Mirna Ortega, de Cultura en Directo, de la Coordinación de Difusión Cultural de la UNAM, así como a Lizy Sells y a Francisco Carballo, co-curadores del ciclo, y desde luego al Museo Universitario del Chopo, a su equipo. Les dejo pues para nuestra primera charla con Hans Ulrich y Tino Sehgal. Muchas gracias.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much to Museo del Chopo for the invitation to do this conversation today with Tino. And thank you so much, Tino, for taking time on your birthday. I wanted to start by wishing you a very, very happy birthday.
Thank you.
And maybe before we start, we should talk about the light. Isa Ganske once said more light research, and actually you have a very special light lighting today this Zoom conversation, a lamp by Pierre Week. Can you tell us about that?
Yeah, I got it from the gallery. We're at the same gallery, twice at the same gallery, and I got it from the gallery for my 40th birthday, which is 5 years ago, so now I'm 45 today. And I don't know what it really is because it has a bit of a weird light, but you can see how it looks. So it looks like this. And that's it.
You and I have this ritual that we record a conversation every 2 years. So we're going to talk a lot today about, 2019, 2020. We talk a lot about, of course, the exhibition you co-curated, which has a very strong focus on ecology, and about some other new projects and new works. But I wanted to just, I think it would be interesting for everybody who is with us here today to hear a little bit how it all began. And I think it was particularly interesting, I think, to revisit your beginnings as an economist. You were interested in long-term development. You wrote an early text about the politicization of the economy. And all of that came actually to my mind because I did a long conversation last year with Kate Raworth, who has written the amazing book about the donut economy. She basically takes the donut as a model, and there is a outer ring in a way which needs protection. There's the life support system really of the planet. Sort of the idea also that the economy is not floating on a neutral background. There is the environmental dimension, there is the caring work, which is often ignored. There's the value we create that doesn't get monetized. So in this really excellent book where she uses the donut, it's really about the safe space in a way between planetary and social, boundaries. And talking to Kate, we of course also discussed my teacher, Professor Binswanger, who passed away and who was a great influence on you and on me. He was my professor at the university in St. Gallen, and actually a few years before he passed away, he was in his 80s, you wanted to meet him, so we arranged actually a conversation between him, Binswanger, you and me about notions of limits of growth, where you state that the growth can happen, but doesn't have to be material. Can you tell us a little bit about the beginnings of you as an economist and how you then came from there to initially to dance and then to visual arts?
Yeah, I also want to thank Lizzie Sells, who set up this conversation in London for a museum in Mexico. It's very kind of sign of the times. And how it all began, I think that, as I've said many times, I think when I was growing up as a teenager was like in the late 80s, early 90s, I was not at all interested in art or culture. Also, I came from a background where you didn't really know about these things. And, there was the only culture, pop culture was really available, so MTV. And then I lived in the suburbs. And so like so-called high culture didn't really exist. And I was mostly interested in politics, and my interest in politics was, of course, the big theme of our generation is that we're using up too much resources for other, to the extent that other generations won't be able to do anymore. And also by using up so many resources, we might change the way, the climate on this planet, the ecological balance on this planet, that also life might be more difficult to live than it was maybe in the 80s. And so this big question of our generation was a big question for me, and I was busy with that, and I was kind of taken along also by there was a big green movement in Baden-Württemberg, because the region of Germany where I grew up, which I think is probably the biggest region which is run by a green prime minister nowadays, probably in the world, I assume. And so a lot of people were busy with that, and I would be taken as a teenager to some kind of political debate, and I should speak for the green activist group, and I was kind of the teenage voice, and I remember at one of these meetings, it was about how to improve the öffentliche Nahverkehr. So how do you say that in English? Like the public transport in around Stuttgart. And I was to speak, and so I did my part, I spoke, but at the same time, I was focused on the Minister of Transport, who was in the room and was kind of heading the whole thing. And I was just observing him as a human being and seeing how he was kind of feeling out the room, kind of saying what the room could still take, wanted to hear, kind of taking the temperature of the room and then speaking accordingly. And I realized in that moment that what I had understood as politics was more like a kind of administration of politics, and that a democratic politician cannot go, but this was me as a teenager, cannot go against any idea that the majority of people have. So the truer form of political work was to work on the values of people. And so that's how I became interested in culture, and I didn't really look back, you know. And I thought, you know, art is a way of a long-term discourse on what our cultural values are. It's maybe the only, as I've said many times, the only long-term institution in our kind of Western market-based democratic societies, you know, which I would say, without knowing Mexico too well, Mexico is part of that kind of framework, you know. And so where do you have long-term institutions, long-term even spaces for long-term thinking? So I felt that culture, and then especially the museum, was the right place for me to go. And then I wanted to understand this society, which is so economically dominated. At the same time, I also wanted to see what was possible to do without producing things. So I started to study dance, both in the same week, economics and dance. So that's how it all came. That's the beginning.
I love it that you actually come to, you know, the point of the long duration. A museum as a kind of a long duration institution brings us, of course, also to Fernand Braudel, no, and the French Annales School of Historical Writing, which I mean, Braudel called it longue durée, and that was opposed to Simeon's notion of eventual history. And there's a really interesting book actually by Kate Ravor's partner, Roman Krujanic. So Kate, who wrote The Donut Economy, and her partner Roman wrote this book, How to be a good ancestor, and writes about these different dimensions, actually how we can go beyond short-termism, no, in society, like through cathedral thinking, through deep time humility, through legacy mindset, through intergenerational justice, through holistic forecasting, also through transcendental goals. And we're certainly going to come back to some of these points later on in the conversation. I just wanted to stay a little bit with these beginnings, how you then shifted from economy to dance and then to art. If we can have a little bit of a shortcut of how this all happened, it would be great to hear that, because it's always interesting to see where the catalogue raisonné of an artist begins. And in a way, in terms of your presence in the world of art or museums, sort of outside the dance world, it's of course the piece, instead of allowing something to rise up to your face, dancing Bruce and Dan and other things, a piece which still is often actually visible today. You've restaged it, you've replayed it quite frequently. So it would be great to hear how, in a relatively short time, you came from being an economist to the dance world to then the arrival in the museum world. And if you could tell us about this beginning, in a way, of the catalogue raisonné.
Yeah, I mean, it's actually quite simple. The reason why it happened all at the same time is because it's all related to the same questions. Like, what do we do with our obsession with things, you know? And this obsession with things that we have in the 19th and 20th century, that, you know, we produce more than we've ever produced. We believe that production can bring a good life more than we've ever believed. We have more problems, the sustainability problem arising out of this, than we ever had. And also we have maybe psychological, you know, well-being problems arising out of it. So I studied economics because I wanted to look into this question of things. I started dance because it was a solution to this question of things, and the museum was the temple of things, you know. And so instead of allowing, it's also not like this long title, instead of allowing something to rise up to your face, dancing Bruce and Dan, is kind of programmatic, because it's like the first words are instead of allowing something, right? So it's all the same. It's like, what can we do instead of doing things? Well, one thing is to dance, to sing, to interact, you know, because I think it's gotten better since the 80s and 90s, but I mean, we're more social, more creative, more kind of interpersonal, intersubjective, more immaterial, if so wish, society nowadays. But so I think there's a little bit less focus on things, you know. But of course, we're still a society which basically believes that, you know, the more you produce, the happier everybody will be. And there's truth to that. The problem is just that it doesn't really go all the way, you know. That's also kind of, you know, there's been a lot of psychological studies on that, you know, like that, which people are, let's say, happier, etc. And John Maynard Keynes already said that in the 20s of the 20th century, you know. And so those are the beginning, and it's all really one thing. It might seem like very separate, but it's all combined by this question of things.
And the beginning of our collaboration goes almost 20 years back, when we met in Frankfurt and actually recorded the first conversation, which marked the beginning of this infinite conversation. But it also, the first collaboration is also Do It. And I thought it would be interesting to talk about that, because we are revisiting Do It at the moment, because Do It, it's an exhibition we started in '93, actually, with Boltanski and Lavier, when we sort of thought to make an exhibition only with instructions and recipes and how to manuals. It was very inspired, of course, on the one hand by Yoko Ono, also by Fluxus, and also by the idea of the open scar of Cage, and then at the same time, of course, by Glissant, and this idea how one could actually make a global exhibition, which at the same time would be resolutely local and would always produce local content, would not sort of be imposed to places, but always be interpreted in a different way, and where always local artists would be added in a way to the mix. So now it's interesting that actually last year during the lockdown, all of a sudden I got a lot of social media alerts, first on WeChat, also, you know, in China, and then in Europe, that actually people had again revisited the Do It books. It's been translated in many languages. And it was very touching to learn actually that people around the world kind of turned to Do It during quarantine. So we decided to revisit it and do a whole new version during that time when physical mobility is restricted, and in a way Do It allows us to kind of go beyond the screen and the zooms and the and in a way things can be realized and interpreted and done through paint or words or music or all kinds of mediums. So it's kind of an open invitation, one can say, for anyone to let art expand the horizons, not only as a passive observer, but to do something themselves. And we're doing a book now, which is sort of an environmental Do It with the serpentine and penguin. And you're actually, for that, revisiting your very early Do It piece, which was our first collaboration. Can you tell us about these two versions of Do It?
I mean, the first time I think when you did Do It, I think it was my first invitation to any kind of art exhibition, and it was actually in Mexico. It was the Carrillo Hill Museum, and then I wanted to show this work of mine called This Is Good, and then yeah, of course, it needed much more care, to use this word that you evoked earlier, much more work of care with people. So I was just at the beginning of my work, and so obviously we didn't really manage to set up the work. And I think that for all the reasons that you mentioned, obviously Do It, you know, is interesting. It's also in a way like it's a thing that you did in the 90s, and now kind of popular culture kind of in this lockdown moment started generating similar things. Now that people started redoing artworks at home and posting them on social media, etc. To me, I think, you know, I think you deserve all the credit for this, but you know, like it's one of our games also that I like to criticize your shows, so you forgive me. But I think this is really a good one. But nonetheless, you know, like one can also think, where is it coming from? And it's very much coming out of this conceptual art paradigm, you know, that somehow you just need a concept, and the concept can be the art, and then and that's it. Like the idea can be the art, and I'm not sure that's true, you know. And maybe that's my work at the beginning didn't really work in Mexico in 2001. It was because I think today we need much more composition, precision, craft work, you know, like handiwork. And I think these things matter, and the whole idea that somehow just an idea could be a work of art, to me it seems a little bit simplistic, almost a bit modern, you know, like here's the idea and then it can come into reality no matter what. No, like how it comes into reality is an important thing, you know? And so that's why, and that's an energetic thing also, you know, the energy of a material, or like when Lizzie, who's invited us to do this thing, when she's doing a work of mine, there's a certain human quality in the room, you know? It's not just my idea, you know, or my choreography. It's also the way Lizzie does it, and the way also what she wants to do, but also in a way what she can't help doing, which is just being herself, you know, and the energies which come through that. So for me, I'm a little bit, for me, I'm much more interested in the care work which goes into something, you know, and the energetic, let's say, charging of a certain situation, like in my work, or energetic charging of a material, let's say in Jeff Koons's work, just to annoy some people, and then you know, and to see what that energetic frequency does in a room or does to a situation, you know. So I'm a bit skeptical that this legacy of conceptual art is so important today. What is important though is maybe the prosumer aspect, you know, or the IKEA effect, that somehow you produce it yourself, you know. And this is something that you could expand on in the way that people start really not doing it in museums, but start doing, you know, do it at home or something, you know, and building, like, and that's what you've done with the books. So the books are more interesting in that sense, because you can read them and maybe people do them, and I don't know, and then they have a little work of art they can enjoy. My work for the book, after I realized that my work didn't really work in the do-it framework, is then I did a work for the book, so to say. And that relates to your first question, which is you are already doing all of it, you know. And I think what was also always theoretically interesting for me about the, let's say, sustainability problem or like ecological problem, you couldn't really play the blame game, you know, because we're all part of the problem, you know, like everybody, at least in, like, let's say the northwestern hemisphere of this planet, you know, is using up much too much material, is emitting much too much carbon dioxide via that. And so we are already doing, you know, all of these effects that we might also be concerned with, you know. And at the same time, I mean, you're already doing all of it, is also just, to my mind, speaks to this kind of, you know, something that I'm always interested in, is like saying, like, you are an agent on this planet, you are a powerful entity, you're not just a receiver of a certain kind of sender artwork or something, you know. You have, reality doesn't work like that. Reality doesn't work like senders and receivers, and that's why artwork shouldn't work like that either.
Yeah, I agree with most of it, but I don't think that you know, the conceptual art kind of aspect was actually the main thing. It has always been much more the kind of connection to DIY, you know, DIY poetry via Eileen Miles also. Then also, you know, if you think about Enzo Mari, who just kind of curated the show of Enzo Mari at the Triennale, which is still on until October, sort of a retrospective. And of course, in the center of it is his autoprogettazione, where he developed a sort of a whole idea, a whole very sustainable idea of, you know, do-it-yourself design, which he considered more actually to do with sort of transmission of knowledge, you know, so that everybody can actually, that the knowledge kind of transmitted in a way that everybody can maybe, you know, do these autoprogettazione pieces by him. So I think that has always been the kind of main thing, but I agree with most other points. Now, one thing which is interesting is, if we go, you know, I reread kind of all our conversations, and we talked about your very beginning and about the first, you know, the first works. Now there is a change, and that particularly in the 2017 conversation, that sort of came through, that you increasingly felt that even if you sort of questioned the idea of the sort of modernist separation, there was still something in the construct of an artwork which always connected it to sort of individualistic, autonomous, singled out kind of entity. And you say, if one sort of sticks to that, there is a risk that it still sort of continues in that sense, the separation of modernity. And that sort of in the 2017 conversation, that comes out very clearly, that sort of brought your practice beyond the idea of a piece, beyond the idea of a work, which has a title, and that you actually started to craft much more scenes. You started to craft more experiences. And that brings us kind of closer to now. So I thought it would be interesting to hear a little bit about that change, which, I mean, could be seen in the Palais de Tokyo show very strongly, in the Gropius show.
Any culture, any language has its kind of precepts, its preconcepts, which it needs to kind of put onto reality to kind of, I think Rancière once called it like le partage du sensible, it has to kind of partition what you can experience, in a certain way, and make it digestible through making it like slicing it up into notions. And so we have these notions, like artist, work, visitor, and they come from a certain time, and the older I get, I'm much more interested also, having had the privilege to really play in different cultures. Maybe the most striking for me was in Morocco, where we showed something on the Jabal Efna Square in Marrakesh, and where people didn't even know the word artist, but they were happy to witness what we were doing and to partake. But the idea that this was art, or that I was an artist, no, we were doing a halka and I was the malem, the kind of the leader of this troupe or whatever. And so I've become much more, let's say, through doing this for many years, I've tried to focus more on what is maybe in my mind, of course I cannot do my own precepts, let's say, but it's my mind, something which is more basic, is that somebody goes somewhere and has a certain experience with a certain kind of energetic frequency, which will do something to him or her or not, and how do I arrange, and I'm the person who kind of arranges and organizes this, and what kind of human contact, what kind of human reconsiderations might happen in such a moment, and the more they happen, the better the situation is. And now then how somebody else then comes and frames it for art history, or frames it for culture, or frames it for a market transaction is then secondary, And so, and I think that goes also back to the very beginning, that at the end of the day, it's what our core interests are, like my core interest at the end of the day is a political interest, but I do this political interest with a lot of respect for the game called art, and so I do it inside of this game, which is an established game in society, but it's not a game which has been around forever. I mean, the kind of exhibition, art as an autonomous notion has been around for maybe 200 years. And it's my mind not sure at all how long it will still stay around, but it's a game, and it's a game you can learn how to play, and you can, some people play it well.
Can you maybe give an example for that? Because I think the Gropius Bar and the Palais de Tokyo, for me, are unforgettable experiences when you did projects really on the scale of the entire building. And there were these scenes as part of the experience where you pulled people together, and these were not necessarily pieces by yours with a title. It's a different kind of experience. So it would be great, I think, for everybody who is with us here today to just hear you maybe describe sort of one of these situations, and to understand kind of better how you sort of went beyond this idea of a construct of a work, which is a singled out entity, because I think really something shifted in these shows.
I mean, maybe it's easier to talk about the Gropius Bau show like here over Zoom, because it's a little bit more simple. So basically the Gropiusbau you can imagine as a very big atrium, like a huge atrium kind of floor or hall with mosaic floor. And then around it, I had 4 spaces. Around this kind of atrium hall, there were 4 spaces. So one work was in one of the 4 spaces, the second work in the next, third, fourth, in these spaces around the atrium, and the 5th work was in the atrium. But the thing was that all 4 works, more or less, came to the atrium. So you already had these transitions. So it would not always be the same work in the atrium, because my works are, enacted by people. They can easily move because they have legs. So they basically, I would make a transition how somebody would leave a piece in one of these adjacent rooms and then walk towards the piece which is happening in the atrium, like for example, Kiss, and then they would kneel next to the people who are doing Kiss, and then at some point the people who were doing Kiss because they're mostly lying down, they start kneeling, then they sing a little bit together. That's then another piece called Yet Untitled, and the people who did Kiss, they go away and they take one of the free spaces now available, one of the 4 adjacent free spaces. And so like this, there was always a rotation of what was the main piece in the center. And then, like I said, then there was also a moment, like you said, like when everybody left the 4 rooms and they all kind of sang together this kind of choir song I had composed. And then they would sing that, and then they would go back to their 4 rooms. And I would decide, this was this kind of live directing, I would decide also depending on the visitorship and the vibe of the moment, I would decide which of the 5 pieces would stay in the middle after this scene where everybody comes together on this, let's say, agora of the atrium, sings together and then leaves again.
Thank you. It's really great to hear this description, because, and let's stay with the Gropiusbau, because the Gropiusbau brings us all as well to 2020 really, and to the Just Past, which is actually the exhibition you co-curated there. It's an exhibition you initiated with Thomas Oberender and several other curators. It's a show again on the scale really of big parts of the building, not the entire building, but the whole sort of the whole ground floor space. And I wanted to ask you to tell us about that, because it's an exhibition called Down to Earth. And it's interesting because we are working actually at the Serpentine on a show called Back to Earth, where we, as a long-term project, the idea is to really work on it for many, many years, invited artists to do campaigns. So not only an exhibition, but environmental campaigns. Sort of practitioners from all fields are invited to respond to the climate emergency, and in collaboration with partner organizations propose these campaigns. And then there are gallery programs on-site, off-site, online. It's a sharing also of resources to kind of amplify these campaigns and kind of get these artist campaigns into society. Now, your project was for me a very fascinating and incredible experience in a year where we saw very few exhibitions, much less, and where there were many lockdowns, and actually it was sort of during the summer. So there was a moment, there was a window when this exhibition could happen. And it's an exhibition where you talked about different things. You talked about this idea that it's also about not doing certain things anymore. So it's sort of a negative variant of, of keeping things away or not doing them. For example, not switching on the climate system in an organization. But it was also a very sort of multi-layered experience, because on the one hand, one could experience sort of artists who have worked with our environmental questions since the 60s. For example, Agnes Dennis, or also the Harrisons, who are of course pioneers. And then at the same time, there were installations which are basically rooms, one can say, thinking about the spider inhabiting a room of Thomas Saraceno, or the drawings of Ku Shonga or Asad Raza. But then there was also a kind of a space which would permanently change. I mean, I was only in Berlin for 2 days, so I didn't experience the full program, but I experienced debate actually about museums and how museums can actually address the CO2 question in very practical ways. And then a few hours earlier, Max Stewart's solo piece was enacted, and then there was a kind of a sonic performance later. So the space kept changing. So can you tell us a little bit about this exhibition, the return to the Gropiusbau, this time as a curator? And it seems interesting because also certain things, and that's where it does actually kind of connect to do it. You said that there are certain activities, you know, which people can find interesting and then maybe do themselves, you know, so that it also, that the exhibition can somehow also go into our daily life.
I mean, it kind of relates back to what you started the conversation with, no, like the beginnings. I mean, I came into art because I thought it was the most effective place to think about like this kind of question of sustainability, because art is focused on visual art and museums are focused on things, and our sustainability problem comes out of this kind of uber focus on things, you know. Then of course when I started working in culture in the 90s, early 2000s, of course I had to realize that nobody was really interested in this topic. If you look at our first interview from 2002, the only thing I talk about is the sustainability problem. It's just that I understood already at the time that like the sustainability problem is much more about doing than about saying, you know, I can say whatever I want. You know, for me, very formative was this study in the 90s in Germany where they looked like that the people who used up the most carbon dioxide per year were the people who supported the Green Party, you know. And of course, I'm sure that their views were, you know, like their views and their intentions were really good, but they were better off, traveled more, and used more carbon dioxide than probably, you know, like, I don't know, an older lady lives in a village and doesn't travel, you know, and votes for the Christian Democrats. So for me, it was very clear that it was about doing and not saying already at the time. And I also I thought that the sustainability problem had been put into a bit of a niche, you know, where it went with a certain lifestyle, a certain dress code and stuff like that. So if you look at our 2002 conversation, like the first 3 pages are only about that. But I don't use the word environmental or sustainable. I just talk about like resources, the atmosphere absorbing carbon dioxide or something like that. And that was enough for people to, I think listen, but at the same time, it was in the way art worked at the time, it was more like, okay, an artist is saying somehow interesting things, not sure how it relates to the work, but we like the work, you know? But I kept on saying my things, and I also understood that culture wasn't really interested in that topic, and art wasn't really interested in that topic, but it was interested in my work. And that was in a way better, because it could show that like a product, like I'm talking about my work, like my product, Tino Sehgal's work, could be attractive in and of itself. It could use very little carbon dioxide because it doesn't really transform material, it doesn't transform things, but it could be seen as attractive in and for itself, for its effects, you know, and not because it's somehow good or somehow environmental, you know. So I was in a way content with the situation, but of course almost physically aware that like people wouldn't get where I was coming from, you know. And I think it has a lot to do with this thing that I think, you know, the field of art, the field of culture, you know, it's a certain kind of, you know, it's a place of sophisticated conversation. Let's put it like that, you know, like it's a game of sophisticated conversation, of sophisticated attitudes, and that's all good, but this doesn't work with ecology problem, because ecology problem is more a thing of doing, you know, like, do I now, you know, take the plane or not, you know? It doesn't really matter what I say about it, you know? And so I was aware that the time wasn't really, like this topic wasn't really interesting. And I was also aware, like for the art world, I was also aware that it was very difficult to transform it into a discourse. Then I think people like Bruno Latour, who was always more on the technical side of, like, let's say, theory production, he managed to now bridge this gap a little bit and somehow make it attractive. Plus, the, like you say, climate emergency, like the problem has just grown in scale, and now some of the people who already knew all of the facts, let's say in the early 90s, they now have children who are like demonstrating on the street, and they're like, oh shit, I never took this really serious, and now my child is taken serious, and well, how do I answer to my child? So I think this kind of made it, all of this together made it arrive in the kind of culture sphere. I don't know how it is in Mexico, but like definitely here in Europe and in Germany. And so Thomas Oberender, the kind of director, overall director of Gropiusbau and some other Berlin institutions, he had this idea for this project, and then he asked me to kind of participate, and I said, yeah, okay, but you know, like if we're going to do this, we really can't treat it as a theme. Like we really have to change what we do and not what we say. So I said, if I participate, let's do a show without electricity, and let's try to switch off the climate control. Because the climate control, of course, is a very strange thing, because it uses a lot of energy, like 2/3 of the energy of an exhibition or a museum. And it runs on a standard which is made for old paintings, you know, or drawings. You know, it has to be 20 degrees, 50% humidity, but contemporary art doesn't really follow this logic most of the time. It's a video installation. It's a thing that you can, like, you know, rebuild, like Robert Morris's mirrored cubes were the first examples maybe of that. So why do you have to regulate the temperature and the humidity at such a precise level, which costs so much energy, if you're anyway not really conserving things, you know? So we try to open like the debate on these kind of things, and also especially do them ourselves, you know, because then you realize it's much more difficult to actually do them. There was actually a lot of resistance in the building, like to switch off the climate control. In the end, we also didn't fully manage, you know, because then people said we will lose our legitimation towards lenders, because they see that like our graph is not correct, you know, that we're not able to keep the 20 degrees. And suddenly you come into all these details, which also Bruno Latour is like a champion of, like saying it's all about details nowadays, you know, it's a network of details, so to say. And so that was the main thrust of the show. And then the other thing is something that obviously you and me have worked a lot on in our like Fun Palace, what we call the Fun Palace research we've been doing since 10 years. It's like, what can be a different way of museums being, museums thought of as like individualized, or let's say a ritual for individuals, a liberal ritual for individuals, like where you can come and go as you like with your friends, talk, you don't have to shut up, sit still and look front and listen to somebody. And so in terms of these kind of liberal rituals for individuals, like how can you do a version of this which is less focused on things, you know, comes back to the same question. And so then we had one room in the exhibition, the biggest room, which was just a programmed space, which would have different events, all without like electricity happening. You would walk into it sometimes. So then it would be more, let's say, free roaming or liberal, if you like. I know people can kind of trip over that word, but more free roaming space. And sometimes we would also close it and then open it from another side. So it was more an event space, you know. So we tried to also have like, let's say, plurality of different modalities operating in that space. But essentially it was also about like, what can you do beyond things? It was again also my core question, you know.
Yeah, so it's fascinating because so there is what you call the negative variant, that you don't do things. That's, for example, you don't switch on the climate, the climatization of a museum, you switch it off. And then there is the positive variant, which is this idea where you say, you know, how to actually find different ways to not transform material into products, but to actually you say to create, instead of objects, maybe more life quality or something like that. And the question is, of course, what kind of institution that needs, an institution which will go beyond objects. And that's a conversation we've had actually, yeah, I think quite since the beginning, since we met. I was close to Cedric Price, who together with John Littlewood, actually, who was the pioneer of street theater, came up with this idea of the Femme Palace at the very beginning of the 60s, and it's an unrealized project for London. And the idea would be that it's a place also for uncertainty. It's a place for the unexpected. It's a place where all the disciplines could meet. There was also the idea of a very participatory, very inclusive, very, in a way, community-focused arts organization, and an idea also where all the disciplines would meet, in a way. It's kind of idea that one could only address the big questions of our time, that if one goes beyond the fear of pooling knowledge. And I mean, in Berlin, it was one room, but we've actually together tried to in a way sketch, I wouldn't say build, but to sketch this institution. And it was once in Manchester, at the Manchester International Festival. That was I would say another sketch, but probably the most complex one was the one we did in New York, the prelude to the Shed, where in 2018, an empty piece of land between 10th Avenue and 31st Street became the prelude for a new arts organization. And we collaborated there very closely with the architect Kunle Adeyemi, who developed a temporary structure, one could say, which could change. So many of the participants came from different fields. There was, of course, there was Forsyth as well, Will Forsyth, there was dance choreography, there was also music and concerts of Azealia Banks and Arca and Abra. At the same time, there was a school, Damaya Sadraza. So maybe it's actually interesting to talk a little bit about that, about the prelude, because in a way it could instantly change. I mean, there could also be, there's a whole lecture series we organized there with Dorothea von Hantelmann, and that whole project, of course, came out of the collaboration with Alex Poots, who then, ran the Manchester International Festival and had moved to New York to the Shed, and was in dialogue with him. And it could be a dance performance, which then all of a sudden, because the architecture was so flexible, so it could sort of fall apart and be recombined again, could lead to an evening of concert, and then 5 minutes later, all the elements recomposed, a conversation started. Yes, I think it would be great to hear a little bit more from your perspective about this 2 weeks experiment.
Yeah, I mean, maybe to start more on a kind of fundamental level, I think, which can maybe be interesting, hopefully, for our audience, which we don't see at this point, but we're hoping that they will be there at some point in the future. Hello, if this moment makes it into the edit. I hope you're having a good time in Mexico. I think, that on a very fundamental level, you can say that, every society needs rituals, and it needs rituals to kind of exercise and initiate foundational categories of this society, which keep these foundational categories, foundational notions, which keep this society together, So if we believe that we are like a community which is tightly bonded, we kind of gather in a circle, and the circle itself already, let's say, like if you think of the Sabar rituals, which I know a little bit, that's why I'm mentioning them, the Sabar rituals in Senegal, like the people are on the square of the village in a kind of circle. So the circle is a very clear form, like in the sense that there's an inside which is created and an outside created. This is something that you do when you want to re-instantiate that we are a community, and we're a community that kind of has an exterior. We're not totally open to the exterior, Just to give an example of what I mean by foundational categories and notions, And so the thing is that every society needs that, because it only operates on notions, categories, also on bonds, which get exercised in these ritual moments. now what happens when you enter into kind of historic times? So like kind of what I mean by that, by societies which don't understand themselves as cyclical with the seasons, but like societies which actually change, want to change and then actually change, you know? So as the society changes, also the ritual has to change, you know, because different categories become important and different categories have to be practiced. And like the museum studies sociologist Tony Bennett says, you know, give me a museum and I will raise a society, you know, like that kind of sums it up in one sentence, you know. And like the museum as a kind of notional or categorical laboratory, which then can move out into society. So for me, it's always been the question, my work, and also then in the curatorial work that we've also done together, is like, what is the new ritual for our times? And especially, what do we want to keep, maybe more precisely, what do we want to keep from the newest ritual that we have in Western market-based democratic societies, which is the exhibition ritual? We want to keep certain things. We want to keep that it's individualized. But maybe we don't want only that. We also want collective moments. What we don't want to keep is the idea of the object as the central focus, you know. So that's why I've tried to do that in my own work, and then we've tried to do that in our common curatorial work to like taking, and that I think our working method has been to take this Frederick Price Fun Palace as a kind of working model. And so in New York, what we did is that basically we commissioned Kunle Adeyemi to basically, he built a kind of roof, if you want to imagine it. Basically, it's a roof and a platform, and the walls are on wheels. So it can be a kind of a bigger space, one space only, and then through a kind of mechanical system, which was operated mostly by my dancers, it can be kind of, the walls can be unlocked and they can just roll away. Yeah, it's a thing of a matter of, you know, 10, 20 seconds to do this whole thing. And so because of this flexibility of the space, there could be different events happening over a long duration. So instead of like in my work having one work over like 8 hours over 6 weeks, we could program different works, but they would always be in continuity. So you could still visit it like a museum, like you come at a certain moment, you didn't have to sign up for, you know, some kind of show in a theater and like with limited amount of spaces, but you could just come at any moment. There will always be something happening, so you could encounter it like an exhibition, but at the same time participate, talk with people, and there will be this kind of flux of things happening. So I think that's been our model for a new kind of institution, which is, you know, has the same kind of opening hours, free roaming sense of an exhibition, and at the same time has the kind of more live, embodied, human aspect of theater and of like what you imagine when we say the word ritual. You know?
Sort of stick with this idea of actually producing, you know, kind of own new institutions or structures. I mean, it's interesting, the other person besides Cedric Price we discussed a lot is, of course, Edouard Glissant, you know, and his activities as a poet, as a philosopher, as a public intellectual, as a curator, you know, not only involved literary and theoretical work, but it sort of kept returning also to this idea of actually producing realities. So first of all, he was involved in, you know, Martinique's independence, and then he founded an institute, a school, the Institut Martiniquais d'études, which produced, in a way, was an agent of change and had a huge impact on generations of people, as it changed the school system, so as to say, in Martinique. And then later on in his life, he imagined, you know, as we do in our conversation about the Fun Palace, he imagined a museum for Martinique, which is unrealized, where he wanted to actually create a museum which would not only point at urgencies, but actually find agency to respond to these. And it was his idea actually of an archipelago, instead of a continental institution. It would be a archipelago, because he says that it's in these islands of the, of the archipelagos where he basically grew up, that the idea of creolization, which is the blend of cultures, was most brilliantly fulfilled. He said continents reject mixings, whereas archipelagic thought makes it possible to say that neither each person's identity, actually not a collective identity, are fixed and established once and for all. So he said, I can change through exchange with the other without losing or diluting my sense of self. And that seems also to be a kind of an exciting model and an important model for what an art institution in the 21st century could be. But thinking about production of reality, it's not only the idea of setting up the own institution. I wanted to see if you had any other so far unrealized projects in terms of, going into different fields of society. If you've ever had the idea of founding a school, of starting a school. There was in our early conversations the idea of you maybe going into politics. I mean, it's interesting that, for example, Joseph Beuys in Germany co-founded the Green Party, and of course this year on May the 12th is his centenary. That made me think of that. I think it was in 2003 or 4 in our conversation that you said that you would not exclude to maybe one day go into politics. So just following on Glissant and him saying that he wanted, in addition to his activities as a poet and a philosopher and a public intellectual, go into this sort of production of different realities. I was curious to hear a little bit if there were any such unrealized project of yours.
I mean, maybe my unrealized project is to speak less, like in terms of personal growth, like to listen more, speak less. Although this is a format where we're invited to speak, and thank you again for that. But I think on a personal level, I think that's the first thing that comes to mind,
Let's talk about the Beethoven piece, and just a little bit more about 2020, because of course, we talked in the last kind of conversation we recorded, we talked a lot about you pulling people together in these scenes you described in some of your shows around 2017, 18, 19. And of course, this idea of pulling people together, of creating such gatherings has been impossible since March last year through the social distancing. So it would be great, I think, to conclude, maybe to hear a little bit more about your 2020.
Maybe the most interesting thing, in my opinion, to speak about here is just something that we've also talked about a lot, is that, like, what is the effect of the internet on cultural production and also on cultural institutions, And so that has nothing to do with 2020 per se, but has something to do with, let's say, but it's an increasing phenomena, and I think it has great repercussions for us who are working in art and let's say what used to be called high art, or kind of funded public culture, which I guess the Chopper Museum is also part of, and for me the biggest difference is that when we started out, you started earlier than me, but and I can almost feel that when you meet people nowadays on the street, or you start talking to them, this has changed. That when we started out, it was a certain privilege, let's say, that you had to earn to voice something in public, right? So that was what you would call trajectory, what other people would call a career. So you would start on some kind of practice in whatever field, and if you would earn enough merit, you would somehow be put on some kind of pedestal, and from this pedestal there would be a microphone attached, and depending on the height of the pedestal and the microphone attached, you could voice something into, let's say, the public discourse of a kind of liberal democracy. And so with the internet, what has changed, and so art is one of these pedestals or pillars that you can kind of stand on, and then suddenly you are heard, you know. And most people, you know, don't have or didn't used to have the access to say something in public, and thereby to kind of participate in the construction of a public discourse and the kind of values attached to it, which has always been my concern, as we've discussed here. And so now what happened with the internet is that suddenly that the whole, let's say, topography, the whole territory has changed. That now, in theory, everybody has the possibility to have a microphone and to say something in public. Of course, not to the same degree, and some people can have a microphone, but nobody listens because they only have, like, you know, 2-digit number of followers, and some people have a 6-digit, 7-digit number of followers, and then of course their microphone starts getting bigger, then maybe a public broadcasting service starts getting bigger, then also a cultural institution, you know, like a cultural institution that shows art. And so this is something that I've really been concerned about, because for me, my whole motivation to participate in this game called art was to kind of participate in a long-term, non-short-termism way in public discourse. And now now the internet is a little bit like a sandstorm, which has just, you know, we may be standing on the same pedestal, but the pedestal is not visible anymore. You know, we're on the same level as everybody else, as people who were participating what I call gatekeeper culture. So let's say you're a gatekeeper, you let me in through the gate, thereby I got a certain kind of microphone, and other people like you did that. And now, you know, this still has relevance if one kind of let's say changes this kind of gatekeeper currency into the kind of influencer currency, and, you know, starts having an Instagram account like you do with like 6-digit followers, then you still also have a certain kind of microphone, but also a comparably smaller one than somebody who's working on pop culture. And so I think this development is not a bad one, but I think it's one which cultural institutions and also artists have to really reflect, you know, like, what are we doing? What are we doing in terms of publicness, you know? For me, my activity was also a public activity, but if it doesn't shrink in absolute size, but it shrinks drastically in relative size, it means that its public impact is diminished, you know, and an 11-year-old YouTuber can have more views than my most viewed shows. Then I have to start thinking about what is my practice and how do I organize it, you know? And this is something that you and me have talked a lot about, and I think is not being, in my opinion, you know, I might be wrong, it's not being reflected enough in terms of cultural institutions, you know, and I think the question of quantity really matters. I think that implicitly museums and high cultural institutions were always based upon a kind of top-down trickle, you know, so few visitors or a lower number of attendants, but high legitimation, which pop culture would then absorb and then bring into the wider population. You know, that was the model, but I don't think this model works anymore. Like, pop culture is not interested, pop culture is not going to look at our Zoom here right now, you know, but a few hundred people will, but a few hundred, you know. And so the question is, what is the relevance, for example, of this talk? You and me are both kind of considered to be relatively successful people in our field, but what is really the relevance of what we're saying here? Are we having a conversation with some like-minded, between each other for some like-minded people, or does it actually have a public impact, you know? And maybe it will have, and I'm confident about it, maybe it will have, but maybe much, if it's a good conversation, it will have an impact by maybe in a few decades to come, you know, but not an immediate impact like when somebody who has like maybe a 6-7-digit number of followers makes a public statement. Like, for example, when Billie Eilish is somebody, like, I personally don't necessarily like her music that much. I don't mind it also, but I think Billie Eilish, you know, taking maybe her cues also from what Madonna did in the 90s, but maybe in a better way, she really changed the image of what it means to be human, what it means to be a woman, but also what it means to be human. And she didn't do that out of nowhere. It's not her own original master stroke, but she's somebody who managed to amplify it. And where do somebody like you or me or you know, any big museum in Mexico or MoMA, where do we stand in contrast to that? And how can we reposition ourselves in this kind of, in this new landscape? And I think the chance for us is we have to, unfortunately, we cannot have the luxury anymore of this kind of quasi-aristocratic disdain for numbers. Like, we do have to look at how many numbers are coming to our things we do, but that's just a small aspect. I think the real chance for us as kind of cultural institutions or cultural producers is to realize that a lot of these kind of, the new landscape is shaped by screen offers, you know, all of these offers which have extreme high quantity, have a high impact also onto society, you know, and we've seen really bad versions of that, you know, recently in the US, you know, how quick it can go from social media to real action. But nonetheless, as experiences, they are still all very screen related. As cultural experience, they're always video related, basically. Instagram, YouTube are all video related. And what we can provide is like real embodied experiences and interactions with other humans. And I think that's something which becomes more urgent, that we do that in a very contemporary way, which is accessible through opening hours. And that's made sound like a weird point, but I think it's a really essential point. It's same like Netflix is opening hours, television is not opening hours. We have to be opening hours. We have to have high quantity. We have to have high level of embodied and human contact and connection. And I think then we can also live with the fact that we will never get the kind of numbers that a lot of people in let's say pop culture, entertainment culture, which we are now part of. There is no more, in my opinion, there is also no more high or low culture. There's only culture, and in the large sense, that's a good thing. It's tough for us from the ex high culture field, but it's at large, it's a good thing. It's a democratic thing.
So what would be amazing to wrap up today's conversation, for which I'm so grateful, would be that if you could just briefly talk about this joy and the way how you actually did in Vienna, unusually so for you, in a art historical context of actually not the contemporary or modern museum, but of an art historical museum, of the Kunsthistorisches Museum in Vienna. It's an exhibition which Eike Schmidt had initiated, the director who never arrived. It's a quite extraordinary story. It's a director who was appointed, but then changed his mind. And so it's an exhibition curated by a director who never became director of that museum. And it's the 250th, or at least initiated, maybe not curated by that director who never arrived. And it's an exhibition to celebrate the 250th anniversary of Ludwig von Beethoven. And as I said, you know, I couldn't go to Vienna and see it, but I read that you attributed these music pieces to different actually parts of the body. And it would be great to hear about that piece, and also why you were interested in this idea of Beethoven. I find it very fascinating that you said in an interview that your main sort of motivation was actually that you found it so interesting that 200 years after these pieces were composed, people are still listening to it, and that you wanted to kind of find out why.
I think, first of all, maybe tagging on from what I was saying, because you asked me, why are you doing something in Kunsthistorische Museum? Well, first of all, because I'm an artist and they invited me, but that's of course not so interesting. My interest rather, and that's maybe more interesting, is that it's a tourist site. You know, they have like 3,000 visitors per day normally when there's not a lockdown, and it's a world-class collection. At the same time, it's one of the main tourist sites in Vienna. You know, and so you get a very large cross-section of society, you know, or of global society there. And I was really looking forward to show work which would communicate with all different kinds of people and a large number of them. Because like I said earlier, I think that's a question we don't have the luxury anymore not to ask that question. Then, like, you know, I always like this idea from Alfred North Whitehead, like the adventure of ideas is a book of his, you know, and I think like with Beethoven, you can really see the adventures of melodies, you know, like I find fascinating for Elise, which obviously a lot of people think is cheesy, but like that if you press a button on a keyboard for Elise, this, you know, shows up, or if you have a megaphone, and apparently like on some megaphones or a lot of them, if you press a button, for Elise shows up, you know, and so, and for Elise was a composition, you know, they call it a bagatelle, like it wasn't even sure for a while if Beethoven even really wrote it, and it's not an official work of his. So it's really, nobody supported this melody, so to say, to come into the public, let alone to stay around for 200 years. But somehow it has its own life, its own capacities of surviving. And I have a lot of, you know, I'm humbled by that and a lot of respect for that. And so I also took this invitation as an opportunity to look into this mastery of somebody who lived many years ago and who, you know, has touched, let's say, the souls of generations. And then, like, yeah, like you said, you know, there's, for example, the Egmont Overture, which is a choreography for the head. And then there's the Fifth Symphony, the first movement of the Fifth, there's ba 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 ba, you know, this, the most, probably one of the most famous 3 notes on this planet is a choreography for the arms and the hands, and then it goes like through the whole body. And then the Ninth Symphony, his last thing, the 4th movement of the Ninth, is like a choreography for the whole body. So the whole thing is a kind of a celebration of being human in the double sense, that on the one hand, like of having a body, being a human being, and like, oh, I have an arm, I have a head, and like, how does that actually look like? And it's can be a strange effect, I think, because a lot of these pieces were made, these movements were made at a time which had a different attention span. So our attention span for music is maybe 3 minutes, like a pop song, and his movements are more like 7 to 10 minutes. So for 7 to 10 minutes, you're looking at one body part moving, you know, and it's kind of a weird meditation on this body part and what it can do. At the same time, it's also kind of about being human on a more direct sense. And I think that Lizzie is probably the master at that, is like kind of being human in the space, like welcome, like because only one body part is moving, you can sing. And so it brings together this piece, like all the different elements of my work, like singing, dancing, and being social. Yeah, so that's something, you know, what I can say in relation to your question. I had one last thing to say though, you know, which relates back to our friend Pierre Wieck, you know, and especially his big works that he's done in Germany, like the piece for Documenta, and the Münster piece, the kind of After a Life Ahead, I think it's called, these kind of big, complex interactions between different, you know, the sky, the earth, technology, plant life, organic matter, human life, you know, animal life. And, you know, I think I really recommend that you read, that the people in Mexico read the article that you publish in your Serpentine catalog on Pierre Wieck, done by our common collaborator Dorothea von Hantelmann, on the ontology of art and Pierre Wieck's work, because I don't think it's so easy for cultural institutions to do what you said earlier in this quote, you know, to further a form of living together, because the very essence of art is modern, is separatist, is subject-object related. And this subject-object type of binary dichotomous thinking, you know, which is embedded in the viewer looking at the subject viewer looking at the object of art is at the root of the sustainability problem. And I think Pierre has done a really good job in kind of like showing how you can do art otherwise, but it's not a given that art is helping to understand that we're all interconnected. Yes, maybe in some soft way, yes, but in a hard way, it's very much on the side of like, of the modern divide of nature and culture.
There could not be a better conclusion, and we're going full circle to Pierre Wieck. And I just wanted to thank you, Tino, thank the Museo del Chopo, thank Lizzie, thank you all who are participating today and listening, and see you soon.
Hopefully in real life, yeah.